talked. I'm not real comfortable telling other people how to write things, particularly fanzines, because I think that the most important thing anybody brings to it is their own particular style, their own experiences, their own voice, if you will. Because basically we're all telling the same story. We're starting with the same characters, we have the same parameters, the same things that we know about them, and we may take that off in different directions, but basically it's a very limited base that we're starting from. So I think the only thing that you have is the qualities that make you different. So to say, well, you should write like this, 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 and this, I think is a big mistake, because then all fanzines would end up sounding exactly the same. So I tried to kind of go back and think about things that people have asked me, and I assume that at least every third person in this room has written a fanzine. So I shouldn't have to answer these things alone. I'll be glad to tell you, the way I decide to do things, but I'm sure that there are other viewpoints that are just as valid among you, so I would really like people to contribute that if they can. Particularly because I think I don't write the way most people do. I write the way I'm doing this, which is that I don't have an outline, I don't have a plan, I don't know where it's going, and to me that's the fun of writing. If I can't experience the story as it happens along with the reader, then I can't tell whether someone else would enjoy reading it, because I couldn't enjoy it if I knew what was going to happen all the time. Now I have a friend who, interestingly enough, I use the term loosely, edit each other's scenes. By that I mostly mean proofreading and catching each other on some obvious mistake, particularly if it has to do with B&B, because neither one of us really wants to change the way we do things, and we do things very differently. And that's Pamela Garrett, who writes the last page of every one of her stories first. And I say, why do you want to go on and write it now that you know the end? And she can't understand how I could possibly do it without an outline, without knowing exactly what's going to happen all the time. So we work in entirely opposite ways, which is one reason I know that everybody's got their own way to do it. The outline for Sweet Sleepless Night, if you're familiar with that novel, when she first handed me the outline for it, it was 100 pages. The outline. And I think the novel ended up being, at least, it's maybe closer to 4. It's kind of like a phone book. But she knew precisely what was going to happen in every single scene, all through the book. And if I knew that, I would be too lazy to write, because I like the excitement of finding out what's going to happen next. So the way I tend to do things is to just put the characters in a setting and kind of wait for them to start talking about it. Create a situation, or it could be very small, that will hopefully bring out their feelings about something. And that was one of the first choices I made. When I first started writing it, I wasn't aware of the choices I was making, but afterwards I tried to go back and kind of analyze why I did the things I did. And I think one of them was just thinking about the show in general. What was the outstanding thing about the show? And there were certainly so many different layers and so many great qualities, but what was it that sucked people in to get them here today, this much later? And it had to be emotions. Even though the action was great, the plots and everything else, there had to be an emotional pull from that show, or we wouldn't all still be here. So then it became a question of, well, how do you try to echo that? How do you try to continue with that same kind of emphasis on emotion? And so I guess one of the first choices that comes out when you write anything is loosely point of view, whether you're just going to, if it's a narrative, whether you're going to just tell what happened to these characters. Well, if you think about that, that's very distancing. The characters are over here and you're moving them around like chess pieces. So that really doesn't work for something that you want to get very close to. Also, I think that television, by its very nature, you feel, at least when it's done well, you feel like you're pulled into it. So anything that pushes you out of it, I think that was the unusual part about the show. We didn't feel we were just watching it. We felt like we were feeling it, we were in it, we were part of that world. And so the first thing, I guess, you would have to decide what viewpoint we're going to write from. And I noticed that a lot of writers will do multiple viewpoints all at once. And I think it's because they think it's easier. Because you're not limited. You can say what Father's thinking, you can say what, Vincent's motives are, you can do all this stuff because there's no limitation. But actually, and this is just an opinion, I think that is the hardest way to write. Because it's so difficult to stay in the one person and to make that transition easily between one and another. I think that identifying with one person is much easier, even though it does have its limitations. You cannot say what someone else is thinking or what they're feeling about something. But I think it's more natural because that's the way the world really is. You only know things from one viewpoint, and you can interpret what other people think from the way things they say and their expressions and all, but it's still your viewpoint only. And so, in a way, I think that's much more natural as a way to write. But then you have to decide whose viewpoint. And there might be a lot of reasons for doing that. And most of my stories have been written from Catherine's viewpoint, simply because I felt she was the person whose experience of the show was most like our own. She was a person in the, quote, real world, totally fascinated by this tunnel world and this larger-than-life person that she doesn't quite understand, which is basically our own position, too. So it seemed to be the most natural way for me to go with the story. I remember thinking that it would be really interesting to try and figure out what makes Vincent tick and to get inside his head, and I finally got the nerve to try that in my last story. But in the first place, I decided that for most people watching, they would rather be in Vincent's arms than in his head. So it seemed kind of natural to go with Catherine. Let's see here. I did write a few things down, which I thought was very organized.
Was it
No, this was about 3 days ago, and I can't read my writing. Okay, talking about exposition and description, one of the great things about fanzines is that you don't have to describe 90% of the things that you would in a novel. You cut right to the chase. You don't have to introduce the characters, you don't have to say what they look like, you don't have to really get the setting, because it's already there in everybody's mind. You're writing to such a select market that you don't have to do that. It's very, very different than writing for mainstream. But that's a real benefit. You really don't need it, and actually it can get in the way. I've noticed a couple times, not too often really, but in scenes where there will be lots and lots and lots of description of the physical surroundings. And that can be interesting. But again, I think it depends on what it is you're trying to emphasize. If you do that and it's something very plot-driven, something exciting, you're slowing that down. You're taking people out of there to, release that tension and just maybe make them nod off a little bit. And the same thing with emotions. If you're trying to go for the emotional content and you're busy describing the bedspread for 2.5 pages, it sort of loses